The convent stood for purity, but its walls held only shadows on a cold October morning. The Mother Superior shattered her own reflection. The nuns said it was grief, but no one ever entered her quarters again. The Vatican sealed the record. The mirror was removed. The reason was never spoken aloud tonight. We unseal what was never meant to be seen. The hills rise slowly above Montreux. They are green in summer, white in winter, but always quiet from a distance. They look untouched, like nothing has lived there for centuries, until your eyes adjust and you see the shape, a single, long structure crouched against the hillside, like something older than the stone beneath it. The convent, its walls are dark, not by design, but by age. Centuries of rain have stripped them of their original color. Moss creeps up its base, creeping further each year. The roof, patched in places, sags under its own weight. The city below moves and hums and breathes, but the convent does not. It just waits for years. No one in Montreux could say exactly when it was built. Not even the archives hold a proper record. The oldest surviving parish registry mentions its presence in 1631, but refers to it as though it had already been there for generations. Its foundation stones don't match the style of anything built in that century or the one before. Locals say it was raised to protect those who sought the voice of God in silence and to keep the noise of the world out. But that was only part of it. Inside, the corridors twist unnaturally, as though built in fragments, connected by someone who never saw the whole design. The air there is colder, even in the warmest months, as though the thick walls swallow sound and heat alike. And along every hallway, every turn, every dead end, there are mirrors, each one as old as the stones themselves. Framed in blackened wood, the glass is dull, slightly warped, as if water had once pressed against it for years. And across the surface of each pane, words etched by hand, passages of scripture, some familiar, others not verses. No living scholar could place words arranged in ways the church never taught. No one remembers who carved them. No one ever recorded their making, and no one has been able to remove them without the glass shattering in their hands. The convent's last official caretaker, Sister Eline, told a visiting priest in 1912 that even replacing the mirrors was impossible. Anytime the workers tried to take them down, the walls would not take new anchors. The plaster would crumble. The wood would split. The replacements would fall before the nails held. After 3 attempts, they stopped trying. The mirrors stayed by then. The sisters who had once filled its halls were gone, not dead, not vanished, just left one by one. Over the course of 30 years, they renounced their vows. Some returned to their families in the city. Others boarded trains and were never seen in Montreux again. None of them ever spoke publicly about why they left. Only one, Sister Adele, agreed to meet with a journalist in 1904. Her interview, printed only once in a regional paper that no longer exists, contained a single quote that survived in other accounts. "We went there to escape the world's noise," she said, but it was never quiet. No one knows what she meant, and by the time anyone thought to ask again, she was gone to the convent. From then on, belonged to no one. The church, facing dwindling funds and fewer vocations, chose not to fill it with new sisters. They didn't sell it, didn't tear it down, they just left it, and for the first time in nearly 3 centuries, its halls were empty. At least that's what the records say, because the people who live in the villages along the hill's base, the farmers, the shepherds, the few who still walk those paths, insist it was never truly empty on still nights. They say you can see light from its upper windows, a dim glow like candlelight moving from one room to another, and if you stand in the tree line no closer, you might hear something, not music, not speech, but a low rhythmic murmur, as though a dozen voices are reciting words in perfect unison, too faint to make out, too steady to be mistaken for wind. Locals do not go close or not anymore. They tell the story of a group of boys, sometime in the 1940s, who dared each other to reach the front doors after sunset. The youngest, a boy of 12, reached the steps first, The others watched him put his hand on the door's iron handle. They said his shoulders tensed, his head tilted, like he heard something from inside. Then he turned. He ran all the way back to town. He never said why, but he never went near the hill again, and neither did they in time. The city expanded, but it never touched the hill. Developers bought land all around it, built homes, markets, roads, but the hill remained, not because of lawn, because of cost, because every surveyor, every worker, every man tasked with breaking ground there refused. The reason? They would only ever say one thing, almost the same, every time: it doesn't want us there. By the late 20th century, the convent had become little more than a rumor to most of Montreux, seen only from the roads, a dark line above the trees. No one petitioned to demolish it. No one claimed ownership, and the church, now far more interested in its new buildings and urban centers, seemed content to pretend it no longer existed. But the mirrors, those who have been inside, and there are fewer each decade, say they remain intact, untouched by the decades. The glass still warped, the scripture still legible, and when you stand before them, they say, something strange happens. Your reflection looks off, not just older or younger, or distorted by the age of the glass, but wrong, nay, fraction of a second slower than you, or holding its breath when you aren't. Most people don't look twice. Those who do leave quickly. The last documented visit came in 1986, when a pair of architecture students, on assignment from Lausanne, entered the convent to study its design. They photographed the halls, measured the stonework, recorded hours of footage. Only one tape survived in it. You can hear the two of them walking down a corridor lined with mirrors. Their voices echo faintly as they count their steps, and then there is a pause, a long one. The camera lowers to the floor. One of them whispers, too quietly to hear clearly, and then the tape ends. The university reported the students missing a week later. No remains were ever found. The hill was fenced off after that, not by order of the church, not by the city, by someone. No one knows who. The fence is heavy, iron topped with wire, and the gate at the base of the hill is always locked. But sometimes hikers find the gate open and the lock hanging loose, as if waiting for now. The convent still stands, its walls leaning a little more each year, its roof bowing toward the earth, and its halls lined with mirrors no one dares to touch. The city below keeps growing. The roads keep winding closer, but the hill remains untouched, waiting for what? No one can say, but if you ask the locals, the ones who have lived here longest, the ones who still wake at night and glance toward the slope, they'll tell you the same thing in a low voice, almost a whisper. The mirrors aren't for us. And then they'll look away toward the convent as if something inside might hear them and answer. The wind moves differently on the hill, not fast, not loud, but constant, like a long breath held against the stones. It was late autumn, 1964, when Sister Agnes first arrived. The sky above Montreux was pale and flat, the kind of colorless gray that feels heavier than rain. The city streets were slick with the season's first thaw, and as the car brought her up the winding road, every turn seemed quieter than the last. By the time the convent came into view, the sound of the city had vanished entirely. The building sat motionless at the crest of the hill. Its windows looked blind. The stone was darker than the sky itself. And though it was only mid-afternoon, it felt later, much later. Agnes was 22, frail, as her family often whispered, thin, with sharp wrists and hollow cheeks that made her look younger than her age. Her health had never been strong, though she rarely spoke of it. She had come here, she told herself, to find peace, to escape the weight of the world beyond those walls. She stepped from the car, clutching a single case, her knuckles pale against the leather handle. The driver did not speak to her. He kept his eyes forward as she climbed the stairs, as if eager to leave before the doors closed behind her. The entrance was heavier than she expected, the iron handle cold, the wood stiff, as though resisting inside. The air was colder still. The convent did not feel empty, but it did not feel alive either. The hall stretched long before her, lined with the relics she had only heard whispered about in the novitiate. The mirrors, each one tall, thin, warped by age, their surfaces dulled by centuries of wear, yet somehow unbroken, and across their faces, the carved scripture, blackened grooves, where the words had been etched. She traced one with her finger. The letters were rough, sharp against her skin and the glass. It did not reflect her clearly. Her figure was there, pale, slightly distorted by the warp of the pane, but the candles in the wall, sconces beside her, they were wrong. The flames should have glowed, warm and bright against the glass, but here they dimmed faint halos of light. As if the mirror swallowed the glow before it could reflect it back, she glanced to her left and her right. No one else. Seemed to notice two sisters passed by, heads low, voices hushed. Neither looked toward the mirrors, neither looked at Herbie. Evening. She had met the prioress, been shown her cell, and told of the house rules, prayers at dawn, silence through the day, save for necessary duties, vespers at dusk, and never disturb the chapel after dark. The prioress, an older woman with a face lined deep by decades of stern service, did not elaborate. She did not smile. She did not welcome her in the way Agnes had. Imagine she only handed her a key, told her where to hang her veil, and left without another word that night. As Agnes lay in her narrow bed, the stillness pressed in around her. The convent was not loud, but it was never truly silent. The wind outside seemed to hum through the cracks in the old wood. The walls groaned faintly as the temperature dropped, and, somewhere, a door creaked slowly, as though moved by a hand too patient to be hurried. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily over the next week. Agnes tried to settle into her new life. She scrubbed the stone floors, helped tend the small kitchen garden in the brittle autumn light, sat with the others during prayer, lips moving in unison, voice never rising above a whisper. The others, she noticed, kept to themselves. They were polite, but distant. They answered her questions with as few words as possible, and if she mentioned the mirrors, their faces changed, subtle but unmistakable. Their mouths tightened, their eyes darted elsewhere, and they would find a reason to leave the room. It was in the refectory, during a dim supper, that Agnes first spoke of it aloud. "I think the mirrors make the candles dimmer," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's strange, isn't it?" The sister beside her, a stout woman whose name she had not yet learned, froze with her spoon halfway to her lips for a moment. No one moved. Then the prioress, seated at the far end of the table, cleared her throat. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp enough to still every breath. No one spoke for the rest of the meal afterward. As Agnes returned her bowl to the basin, the stout sister leaned close enough to murmur a warning. "Don't talk about them." Her voice was low. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron. "Not if you want to sleep." Agnes tried to ask what she meant, but the woman had already turned away that night. Agnes could not keep from looking. Her cell, like every room in the convent, had a single mirror hung beside the door. The scripture across it was unfamiliar, the words jagged and foreign, though she had studied Latin for years. The candle by her bed flickered faintly, its flame barely visible in the glass. She leaned closer. Reflection at her gaze, it looked pale, thinner than she felt. Her lips parted slightly, but the reflection seemed slower, as though the glass hesitated before it mimicked her movements. She stared for what felt like minutes, though it could not have been so long. The candle sputtered, and the light, for the briefest instant, went out completely in the mirror, but not in the room. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She stepped back quickly, bumping into her bed frame. The wooden post creaked loudly in the still air. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, she tried again to speak with the other sisters, to ask if they had noticed anything strange, if the mirrors had always been there. Every question was met with silence. Not refusal, not denial, just silence. And the longer it went on, the more Agnes began to notice something else. The sisters avoided the mirrors. They walked past them quickly, heads down, eyes fixed on the floor during their duties. They lit candles in the halls, but never near the glass, and when they prayed, they chose corners, alcoves, Anywhere but the long corridors lined with scripture-carved panes, Agnes started doing the same. Not because she believed, but because it was easier, safer. Until one evening, as dusk bled into the halls and the wind outside grew sharper, she lingered a moment too long. She had been sent to fetch water from the lower corridor, where the oldest mirrors hung, the ones with the deepest grooves, the blackest etchings. The candles there burned lower than anywhere else. Their flames were thin, weak, as if struggling to survive. She paused beside one of the mirrors, the pail heavy in her hand. Her reflection looked back. The words etched across the glass cut through her face, fragmenting it into pieces, and for a moment, she thought she saw something else behind her, shape faint just at the edge of the warped glass. She spun around. The corridor was empty, but when she turned back, the candle beside her went out, only in the mirror, not in the room. The flame beside her burned, steady, warm, and bright, but in the glass, there was only darkness and her own pale face, staring back, eyes wider now, mouth slightly open, as if about to speak, but no sound came. She dropped the pail. The water sloshed across the stones, spreading cold across her feet, and for the first time since arriving, Agnes felt something deeper than uneasy quiet, creeping dread, the kind that settles low in the chest and stays. She did not return to the refectory that night. She stayed in her cell, curled on her narrow bed, the candle burning low beside her, and every few minutes, against her will, her eyes drifted to the mirror by the door. The scripture seemed darker, now the glass dimmer, and though the flame burned steady beside her, its reflection never came back. The halls breathe differently at night. The air feels heavier, the walls closer, every sound, no matter how faint, stretches longer than it should. It was just past midnight when Agnes stirred awake. The candle by her bed had burned down to a nub, leaving her cell cloaked in gray shadow outside. The wind brushed against the old wood, soft and steady, like fingers tracing the beams, and somewhere beyond her door, there was another sound, a whisper too faint to make out the words, but too steady to be the wind. She sat up, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The boards beneath her feet were cold as she stepped to the door and pressed her ear to it. The whispering didn't stop it, moved slowly down the corridor. Agnes opened the door just enough to slip through. The hinges let out a soft groan that seemed louder than anything else in the silent hall. The convent at night felt different. The air colder, the stones slick with condensation. Every candle in the wall sconces burned low, their light stretching into thin, trembling lines across the floor. And the mirrors, they were darker than usual. Warped glass didn't catch the faint glow the way it did by day. Instead, each one looked like a tall, black pool, as if the hall was lined with empty doorways. Agnes followed the sound. Her bare feet made no noise on the cold floor. Her breath formed faint clouds in the air, vanishing almost as soon as they appeared. The whispering seemed to rise and fall, not closer, not farther, but circling the hall like a chant being carried by the walls themselves. And then she stopped because the mirror beside her caught her eye at first. It looked like any of the others. The same scripture etched deep into the glass, the same warped edges, the same faint flicker of a candle somewhere behind her, but the reflection wasn't hers, not entirely. The figure staring back stood where she stood, wore the same habit, the same veil, but the face, it wasn't the one she knew. The skin was pale, sallow, drawn so tight it clung to the shape of the bones beneath. The cheeks were hollow, the eyes dark, sunken, with rings so deep they seemed almost bruised, and the mouth, it was sewn shut thin. Black threads pulled the lips closed, puckering the skin where they pierced through. Agnes couldn't move. Her heart thudded in her chest, heavy and uneven, each beat louder than the last. Her breath caught halfway to her throat. The reflections, head tilted slightly, the black robes, darker than anything Agnes had ever worn, seemed to bleed into the mirror itself, like the figure was part of the glass. And then the candlelight flickered for just a moment. The hall went dim, and when the light steadied again, The figure was gone, only her own pale, trembling face looked back, but something wasn't right. Her reflection's chest rose a fraction later than her own, and its lips, unsewn now, were parted just slightly, like it was about to whisper. Before she could look closer, a sound cut through the hall, not a whisper this time how sharp. Quick creak, wood shifting against wood. Somewhere deeper in the dark, Agnes turned, pulse racing, her breath trembling as it left her lips. The corridor stretched long in both directions, each side fading into shadow. No movement, no sound, just the faint, steady hum of the wind through the cracks. She stepped back into her cell, her hand tight on the iron handle, and shut the door behind her. The whispering stopped the instant the latch clicked. The room was colder. Now the single candle, its flame thin and frail, barely lit the space. She lay back on her bed, pulling the blanket high, her eyes fixed on the mirror by the door. For a long moment, it reflected nothing, not the candlelight, not her shadow, just the black grooves of the scripture, twisting across the glass like cracks in ice. And then, the faintest flickery shape, gone as quickly as it appeared. Her breath stilled. The room didn't feel empty anymore, not entirely, and sleep, when it finally came, did not bring her rest. The chapel's windows turned black long before the sun was gone. Hill blocked the last of the light. The clouds pressed low and heavy, and the candles, their thin flames trembling, became the only glow left inside the convent. Sister Agnes moved through the corridor toward the chapel, a hem of her habit brushing over the cold stone. Her steps were soft, but the hall still carried each one like a quiet echo. Every mirror she passed caught her shadow, stretching it long, bending it until it looked like something else. Compline was about to begin the night prayers, the quietest hour, the one the sisters seemed to approach with more weight than the others. At the far end of the hall, outside the chapel door, the Mother Superior stood waiting. Her frame was slight, stooped with age, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though they trembled if left alone. Her veil cast a deep shadow over her face, but Agnes could see how pale her skin was, almost the same color as the linen collar beneath her chin. When Agnes drew closer, she saw the lines around the woman's mouth, not the soft creases of time, but deep, rigid grooves, a kind carved by years of worry. The Mother Superior did not greet Hirsch. He only looked past her, down the corridor, toward the western wing of the building, and then she spoke, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Do not look into the mirror on the west wall tonight." The words hung in the air, sharper than the chill. Agnes blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "The mirror?" she asked softly. The Mother Superior's gaze did not shift. Her lips trembled before she spoke. "Again, during Compline, keep your eyes on the floor, on your hands, on anything but the glass. Do you understand?" Agnes nodded, though her chest felt tight, and then, after a pause, she asked why the old woman's eyes finally met hers. They were dull, rimmed in red, as though sleep had long been a stranger, and she told her that the last sister who lingered there, a young woman, devout and quiet, whose name no one said anymore, had been found after prayers, still kneeling before the western mirror. Her hands were clasped tight in prayer. Her lips moved silently, as though reciting words, but something wasn't right. Her reflection did not match. The sisters who saw it swore it moved on its own. Its lips kept moving when the girls had stopped, its hands unlinked while hers remained bound together. And then, when one of them reached to touch her shoulder, the reflection turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and looked straight at them. Agnes felt her breath catch. The Mother Superior's own hands trembled as she clasped them tighter. "No one prays near that mirror anymore," she said softly. "And no one should look into it. Not when the bells sound for Compline. Not when the candles burn low." Her voice faltered. "Not ever." Before Agnes could speak, the chapel door creaked open. The others were filing in, their heads bowed, their faces drawn tight with the same tension she had begun to feel in herself. The Mother Superior lowered her gaze, straightened her shoulders, and stepped aside. Agnes followed the line of sisters inside. The chapel was dim. The candles along the altar barely held their light, each flame straining against the drafts. that slipped through the old stone. The shadows stretched high across the vaulted ceiling, making it feel even taller. Emptier, the western wall stood opposite the altar, and there, framed in blackened wood, was the mirror. It was taller than the others, narrow, warped by age. Its scripture cut deep and jagged into the surface. Agnes did not mean to look at it, but she felt its presence, even with her eyes lowered, even with her focus on the soft murmur of the prayers beginning around her. She could feel the weight of it in the room. The air near it seemed colder. The candle flames nearest to it flickered weaker than the rest, their light thinning to almost nothing. When they reached the glass, the sisters' voices rose in a soft, steady chant. Agnes tried to keep her eyes closed, tried to let the sound of the prayers carry her through the hour, but her thoughts kept circling back to the story. The girl, kneeling, the reflection, moving on its own, the head turning, and as the chant grew quieter, falling into the hushed cadence of the final prayers, her curiosity began to press harder than her fear. Her breath slowed, her fingers curled tighter together in her lap and against everything the Mother Superior had said. She lifted her head only slightly. Her gaze slid toward the western wall. The mirror stood there, blacker than the space around it, the scripture across its surface, catching what little light was left. And for a moment, she saw nothing, just her own faint shape, bent forward in the pew, her veil, her clasped hands, the dim halo of candlelight. But then the flame behind her sputtered, and the reflection lingered. It held the posture a fraction too long, its head tilted, not as she had moved, but slower, intentional, and the hands they unlinked while hers remained locked tightly together. Agnes's chest tightened. The breath she had been holding shuddered, free, barely audible over the last whispers of the chant. The reflection's head began to turn, not quickly, not violently, but with the slow, deliberate weight of something aware. Its face tilted, its eyes finding hers through the dim, and that's when she heard a sound, faint and wet, like the creak of leather stretched too far. The reflection's lips parted, hers did not. The voice of the Mother Superior rose suddenly, louder than the others, breaking the rhythm of the prayers. The chant stopped. The sisters, all of them, bowed their heads lower. Agnes wrenched her gaze back to her lap, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her fingertips. The silence in the chapel was heavy. Now every candle seemed smaller, their glow retreating into themselves, and the Mother Superior's voice, steady but strained, spoke the final blessing. The sisters rose as one, but Agnes's legs felt weak. Her breath was shallow, unsteady. As she turned to leave the pew, her eyes flicked just once back to the western wall. The mirror was dark again, still, but the candle nearest to it was out. She didn't see when it had gone dark, and she didn't want to know. She followed the others out, her steps slow, her hands shaking against her sides. Behind her, the chapel door closed with a long groaning creak, and the faintest tremor ran through the old wood, as though something inside had pressed against it from the other side. Agnes didn't turn back, but when she reached her cell, when she slid the iron bolt across her door and let herself finally breathe, she realized her hands were still clasped tight, as if they had never let go since the moment she sat before that mirror, and her knuckles were white, too white, almost bloodless. She tried to release them, but her fingers wouldn't move. Not yet, not until the bells outside tolled again. The chapel feels larger when everyone leaves. The air lingers differently, still but heavy. The candles, their flames reduced to thin, trembling shapes, seem more fragile when no one remains to watch them. Agnes stayed behind that night. Her hands, still sore from clenching through the entire hour of Compline, had only just relaxed when the sisters filed out, their steps soft, measured, almost identical. In rhythm, the Mother Superior had passed last, her veil brushing against the old wooden doorframe as she closed it behind her. The sound of the latch echoed far longer than it should have. Agnes waited until the silence settled, until she could no longer hear the faint shuffle of feet receding into the hall beyond. And then she stood. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she moved anyway, her steps echoing faintly against the old stone floor as she approached the center aisle. The shadows along the vaulted ceiling shifted faintly as the draft moved through the space, but the air itself felt. Still, she told herself she wasn't staying out of defiance, but she didn't believe it. She needed to see it, needed to know what the others were so afraid to face. The western mirror stood silent on the far wall. Its blackened frame seemed to drink. In what little light remained, the scripture carved across its glass, jagged, uneven, deep, looked almost wet in the dim glow. The other mirrors, smaller, lined the side walls of the chapel like sentinels. Their warped panes each caught only the faintest glimmer of the candles, their surfaces appearing darker than glass. Agnes took a seat halfway down the aisle. Her hands rested on the back of the pew before her, fingers interlaced loosely this time, her nails digging into her palms only when she felt her breath falter. She waited. The wind outside pressed faintly against the chapel's windows, rattling them with a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for distant breath. The candles hissed softly as the air shifted around their flames. The first ripple came quietly, so subtle. She thought her eyes were tired. The mirror nearest the altar, not the western one, but another along the north wall, trembled not in its frame, but on its surface, as if a thin layer of water had been poured over it. The light it reflected bent. The scripture across its glass wavered like ink, spreading through a current. Agnes held her breath, her nails pressed deeper into her palms. And then another ripple, this one across the western mirror, slow, wide. The surface swam as though the glass had turned liquid, the reflection of the candles stretching and warping until the light itself seemed ready to extinguish. Shapes began to form faint. At first, kneeling figures, rows of them, stretching into a space that shouldn't exist beyond the mirror surface. Their habits were black, their veils falling forward to cover where faces should have been. Their hands were folded tightly at their chests, heads bowed low, and though their mouths were open, every single one of them, no sound came, not a whisper, not a hum, not even the faintest breath. Silence was worse than any chant. Agnes leaned forward, her throat tight, her body rigid despite a tremor in her knees. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air, dissipating almost immediately. Figures didn't move. Did it sway? Didn't breathe, but their mouths stayed open wider now, like they were singing, only there was nothing, no sound, not even the usual hum of the convent at night. No creak of wood, no whisper of the wind outside. It was as though the world beyond the mirrors had consumed every sound the chapel had left. Other mirrors began to ripple one by one, each revealing more of the same faceless figures, kneeling in endless rows there, dark veils swaying slightly as though stirred by some wind she could not feel. Agnes' heart hammered in her chest. The rhythm of it filled her ears, louder than the silence around her. She wanted to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. Her hands gripped the back of the pew until their knuckles throbbed white, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The largest ripple came from the western mirror. Its surface rolled like a tide, and the figures within seemed to shift closer, as though the space between them and Agnes had begun to collapse. Their mouths opened wider still, the black inside them deeper than any shadow she had ever seen. And though the silence held, she felt something, a vibration low, almost imperceptible, like a sound too deep for ears to catch, settling instead in her chest, pressing against her lungs until each breath felt heavier than the last. But something wasn't right. The nearest candle, the one beside the aisle, just a few feet from where she sat, flickered hard, then went out, not in the room, only in the mirrors. Its flame still burned steady beside her, warm and real, but in every pane of glass, the light had vanished, leaving only the dark rows of kneeling figures, their open mouths now yawning impossibly wide. Agnes's pulse stuttered, her lips parted, a faint, involuntary breath escaping as she stared at the glass. And that's when she heard it, not in her ears, but somewhere deeper, a soundless hum, vibrating low through her ribs, like a note struck on an instrument, far below the threshold of hearing. Rows of faceless nuns swayed in unison, not toward each other, toward her. The vibration grew sharper, her teeth ached, her vision blurred at the edges. The dim glow of the chapel stretching thin until it looked like the entire room had been pulled forward, drawn into the depths of those mirrors. Her breath hitched, her nails broke against the wood of the pew as she gripped it harder, fighting the instinct to cry ouch. She tried to close her eyes, but she couldn't not, yet the figures were closer now. He could see where their veils ended, the suggestion of where faces should have been, but beneath the fabric, there was nothing, no features, no skin, only the endless black of their open mouths. Vibration cut off suddenly. The candles steadied, the mirrors stilled, the chapel was empty again. The only sound was the soft, shallow rasp of Agnes's own breath as she staggered back, nearly losing her footing against the cold stone floor. Every mirror reflected her now, her pale face, her trembling hands, her wide, panicked eyes. But as she turned to leave, clutching the edge of the nearest pew for balance, she noticed something. Her reflection in the western mirror lagged behind by a fraction of a second. It took one step fewer than she had, and its mouth, though hers remained shut, was still open wide, silent, as if it had been singing all along. The corridor outside the chapel was colder than the rest of the convent. The walls here seemed to sweat when the night grew long, a thin sheen of condensation forming on the stone. Each footstep left a faint echo, one that lingered a moment, too long before fading. It was here, just before dawn, that the Mother Superior appeared. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, her hands hidden within the long sleeves of her habit. The air felt heavy around her, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The largest mirror, the western one, stood at the far end of the hall. Its blackened frame seemed to pull every shadow toward it, its warped glass reflecting the dim glow of the sconces in thin, uneven streaks. The Mother Superior stopped a few feet away for a long moment. She didn't move. Her veil stirred faintly in the draft that crept through the corridor, but her body was still. Her shoulders were rigid, her chin low, as if she were bracing against something unseen. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes found the glass, and she stared at first. The reflection seemed ordinary, a faint, pale shape framed by black robes, the deep lines of her face softened by the dimness. The scripture carved into the mirror, cutting through her image like cracks in a frozen pond. But something wasn't right. The reflection's hands were not where hers were, while the Mother Superior's remained clasped inside her sleeves. The reflections hung at its sides, still barely brushing the edge of its robe. The real woman took a breath. Her chest rose, slow and shallow. The reflections did not, for a moment. The corridor was silent. The draft eased. The candles along the wall burned thin and steady, their light barely touching the edges of the mirror's frame. The Mother Superior stepped closer. Her shoes clicked faintly against the stone, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the heavy air. She stopped so near the glass that her breath fogged against its surface in faint, fleeting clouds. Her reflection leaned forward, not by much, just enough to close the distance her own body had left. Her lips parted, but no sound came in the reflection's eyes. They widened, the pupils dilated slowly, as though the dim light were draining from the corridor itself and sinking into them. The real woman's head tilted, her brow furrowing faintly. Her own breath had gone shallow now, each exhale a short, uneven wisp on the glass. The reflection tilted too, but slower, the motion exaggerated, deliberate, as though mocking her. Agnes, standing at the far end of the hall, saw the shift before the Mother Superior did. She had not meant to follow, but the sound of the older woman's steps had drawn her from her cell. Her own feet silent against the damp floor, she didn't speak, didn't dare. The reflection's mouth began to move. Its lips formed words, slow and careful. Though no sound escaped the glass, the Mother Superior's head tilted further, her body leaning closer until her forehead nearly touched the surface. Eyes strained to read the silent words, and that's when she heard it, not with her ears, but somewhere deeper, a whisper, so low it felt pressed against her skull rather than carried through the air. Her hair hands shot free from her sleeves, clutching the edges of the frame as though to steady herself. Her knuckles whitened instantly, her nails scraping faintly against the blackened wood. The whisper grew sharper. Her breath hitched, her lips parted, and her knees buckled. The sound of her body hitting the stone floor was sharp, echoing up the corridor like a crack of wood splitting. Her reflection, however, remained standing, its eyes wide and dark, locked onto Agnes at the far end of the hall. The whisper didn't stop, not for the Mother Superior, not even as she lay motionless, her chest rising in faint, shallow bursts, her fingers twitching against the cold floor. Agnes couldn't move. Her hands gripped the frame of the doorway behind her, her body locked in place as the corridor seemed to stretch longer between her and the mirror. The reflection tilted its head, its mouth opened wider, though the whisper stayed just beyond the reach of sound, and slowly its hand rose, not the Mother Superior. Her reflections, it pressed its palm flat against the inside of the glass, the scripture etched across it, warping around the shape of its fingers. Faint vibration from the night before returned, low, deep, a soundless hum that settled in Agnes's ribs. Pressing hard enough, she felt her breath falter. She tried to call out to the Mother Superior, but no voice came. Her throat felt tight, sealed by the same pressure that pinned her feet to the floor. The reflection's lips moved again, one final word. Its soundless shape was clear this time, and whatever it said, it was enough. The Mother Superior's body jolted once, then went stiller. Chest no longer rose, her fingers no longer twitched. The whisper stopped the vibration, eased. The reflection stepped back into the darkness of the mirror, its edges rippling once, faint as breath on water, before vanishing entirely. The corridor was silent again, only the faint hiss of the candles remained. Agnes's breath came back all at once, sharp and uneven, her hands trembling so hard she could feel the wood beneath her nails begin to splinter. She didn't move toward the body. Not yet. She didn't move at all, because as the air stilled and the silence thickened, she realized something. The western mirror, the largest, the one that had held the reflection, no longer showed her, not even a shadow. Its glass reflected nothing at all, only darkness, and the faint, jagged scripture carved deep into its surface, like it had been waiting for her. The morning broke cold over the hill. The mist hung low, rolling over the worn stones of the courtyard, like a tide that never fully receded. The bell for lauds rang softly, its tone dull in the heavy air, as though the hill itself had swallowed the sound inside the convent. The corridors were quieter than usual, too quiet. The shuffle of feet was absent, the usual murmurs, the hushed greetings, the faint hum of prayer never came. Even the sparrows that nested beneath the eaves were silent, their calls replaced by the faint drip of condensation from the rafters. The Mother Superior's door remained closed. It had been since the night before. No candlelight flickered beneath it. No sound came from within. When the sisters knocked, softly at first, then harder, their knuckles leaving faint scuffs on the wood, there was no answer. Only the faint, muffled creak of the floorboards inside, and then silence again. She had refused her morning meal, refused to lead the prayers, refused to be seen. But something wasn't right when the sisters gathered. They noticed it immediately. Every mirror in the convent had been covered, each one, from the smallest polished pane in the novices' cells to the towering glass along the chapel walls, had been shrouded in black cloth. The fabric hung heavy, stitched together from habits too worn for wear, their hems dragging faintly along the floor. The air in the halls felt thicker for it. The candles burned dimmer, their glow dulled as though the fabric itself drank their light. The sisters whispered among themselves, their voices low, careful. Some crossed themselves as they passed the draped frames. Others quickened their pace, their steps soft but urgent, skirts whispering against the floor. All but one mirror had been veiled. The western mirror, the largest, the one no one would approach it, stood at the end of the main corridor, its frame blackened further than the others, its jagged scripture glinting faintly in the gloom. Nailed cloth covered it. No hand dared to touch it. Agnes stood near the bend in the hall, her fingers grazing the edge of the stone archway. As she watched, the sisters moved past. Their faces were pale, their eyes lowered, but none of them looked at the glass, not directly. They passed in silence, their hands clasped, their lips moving faintly with whispered prayers. Only Agnes lingered, the mirror reflected. The corridor, long and narrow, stretching back into the dimness. Its surface was still, but the light it held felt. The sconces along the walls glowed steady in the air, but in the reflection, their flames were weaker, paler, like the glass itself was swallowing their warmth. Agnes's chest tightened as she stared, her breath shallow, each inhale cool, and then behind her, one of the sisters murmured her name, urging her to move, to leave it. She didn't. Their eyes remained on the glass, her body drawn forward despite the tremor in her hands, and that's when she heard a faint sound, almost beneath the threshold of hearing. Not a whisper, not words, just a low, steady creak of wood shifting somewhere behind the walls, as though the convent itself was holding back something heavy. Agnes stepped closer. Surface of the mirror did not ripple, the scripture did not glow, but the corridor within it looked longer, now stretched, as though the walls beyond the glass had pulled apart, creating space that shouldn't exist. Her fingers brushed the air just before the frame. Cold radiated from it, not the chill of stone, but something sharper, deeper, like the air itself had thinned. Her breath fogged faintly before the surface. Reflection followed, but with the slightest delay, a fraction of a second, enough to make her hand tremble as she pulled it back. Sisters behind her began to recite a prayer under their breath, not in unison, not loud, but enough to fill the hall. With a faint, uneven rhythm, it didn't drown out the silence. Nothing did. The Mother Superior's door creaked faintly down the corridor, a sound so soft it froze the sisters in place. The latch didn't turn, the hinges didn't open, only the wood shifted, as though the weight behind it had shifted closer. And then, as quickly as it came, the sound stopped. The sisters dispersed slowly, their voices gone, their steps cautious, as they retreated into the dimness of the convent. Agnes remained by the mirror, her reflection still lagging faintly behind her. The western glass caught her eyes, the scripture across it twisting subtly as the light from the nearest candle bent against its grooves. The air near it felt thinner with every passing breath. For the first time since arriving at the convent, she realized she could not hear her own heartbeat, not at all, just the faint, cold hiss of the wind outside and the quiet creak of wood somewhere deep behind the walls. The fog on the hill did not lift that morning. It lingered low and heavy, swallowing the courtyard, dulling the sound of the convent bell as it rang for prime. The air was colder, wetter, each breath a thin cloud that dissolved before reaching the ground. The sisters had risen in silence, even the youngest among them, who often whispered prayers beneath their breath as they dressed, spoke none this day. They moved in single file through the narrow corridors, heads bowed, their veils brushing against the rough stone. As they passed outside, on the gravel path, the crunch of tires broke. The Quieta black car rolled through the gate, its headlights dull in the mist, its engine low and steady. A second followed, then a third. The sisters paused as the vehicles came to a stop in the courtyard, their engines cut, leaving only the faint hiss of cooling metal and the occasional drip of condensation falling from the eaves above. The men who stepped out wore no smiles. 4 priests, dressed in plain black cassocks, their collars white, their coats heavy and buttoned, high against the cold. None of them carried luggage. None spoke as they surveyed the grounds. Their eyes moved not to the sisters, but to the main hall, and behind them, 2 others emerged. Not priests, gloved men in dark coats, their faces half hidden by the brims of their hats, each carrying a wooden crate between them. The lid bore a painted symbol, the crossed keys of the papal seal, marked in stark white against the black wood. The sisters lowered their eyes, not in reverence, in fear. No word had come from the bishop, no letter, no warning. The men had arrived unannounced, their movements swift, precise, and none of them would explain why, but something wasn't right. The priests entered the main hall without ceremony, their boots clicking softly on the damp stone. The air inside felt heavier as they passed. a faint draft curling through the corridor, as though the building itself exhaled at their arrival. Agnes lingered near the chapel doors. She watched as the men moved through the hall, their steps unbroken, their faces fixed forward. They did not bow, their heads at the altar. They did not pause at the veiled mirrors along the walls. At the western mirror, it stood at the end of the corridor. Uncovered, its surface dim, the scripture carved into its glass, catching what little light there was in thin, jagged lines. One of the priests stopped before Ive, did not touch the frame. He only looked, his head tilted slightly as he studied the reflection. Or rather, what should have been the reflection. His lips tightened into a thin line, and he turned to the others. They exchanged no words, but their movements quickened. The gloved men set down the crate. Its lid creaked faintly as the metal latches were drawn open. The smell of raw cedar and iron filled the hall as the heavy wood split apart, revealing a padded interior lined with lead. The priest stood back. The gloved men approached the mirror. They did not glance at its surface, did not meet their own reflections. Their gloves gripped the blackened frame, their bodies tense as though bracing for something unseen. The mirror's weight made the old stone beneath them groan faintly, the sound carrying low through the silent corridor. The glass did not ripple, the scripture did not shift, but Agnes, from her place near the chapel doors, saw at the faintest delay the hands in the reflection, gloved like the men's, gripped the frame a fraction of a second after the real ones did, and when the mirror tilted, lifted free of its mounting, the reflected corridor behind it did not match. Its walls stretched further, its light dimmer, as though the hall inside the glass led somewhere deeper than the convent itself. Agnes's breath caught her fingers, curled tight against the wooden doorframe beside her, her nails scraping faintly at the grain, and that's when she heard Ida. Low creak not from the floor, from the glass. The sound was subtle, almost beneath hearing, like wood settling in winter. The gloved men didn't react. The priests didn't flinch only. Agnes froze, her eyes locked on the surface of the mirror as they turned it sideways, angling it toward the crate for a moment. Her own reflection came into view, but it didn't move with her. It stood still, its face pale, its eyes wide, its lips parted, not to speak, but to breathe. Yet Agnes herself was not breathing at all. Her chest was tight, her lungs refused to fill. The moment broke as the mirror slid into the crate. Lead-lined walls swallowed the reflection, the faint creak fading as the lid lowered into place. The metal latches snapped shut, their echo sharp in the silent hall. The priest signed the crate with chalk, a single mark across the lid, the same sigil as before. Beneath which one of them scrawled a line in dark ink. Agnes couldn't read it from where she stood, but later, when the record was found, only one note remained. Reflection incongruent, remove immediately. The crate was carried out. The men left without another word. No blessing, no farewell. The sisters were gathered in the chapel. One of the priests, the eldest among them, addressed them only once. His voice was low, deliberate, each word measured. They were to speak of this to no one, not to the bishop, not to their families, not even among themselves. The archives smelled of dust and iron, the kind of air that settles when papers have not been touched for years. The light from the single desk lamp was weak, filtered through a yellowed shade that gave everything a muted glow, as though the room itself were reluctant to reveal too much. The historian sat hunched over a stack of brittle folders, his fingers tracing the edges of each page carefully, the way one might handle something alive. The documents were dated, some stamped with the seal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Others bore only faint imprints, their ink faded, their corners singed as though they had been too close to flame. The folders contained reports, transfer logs, a handful of testimonies written in careful Latin script, and a name that surfaced repeatedly. Montreux. He turned another page. The handwriting shifted, a different scribe, the ink darker, fresher despite the age of the parchment. The words were clipped, as though written in haste. They described the removal of a single object from the Hilla mirror. The notes were sparse, the language clinical, each entry separated by long horizontal lines, as if to keep the thoughts contained. Then, The final page, its top corner, bore the papal sigil, pressed deep into the paper, but the text beneath it. Every line had been covered thick, black strokes of ink, layered again and again, so heavily that the paper itself had buckled and warped beneath the weight of it. No words could be read, no impressions lingered beneath, only a single note, written at the bottom margin in a smaller, careful hand. Archive sealed by order, do not pursue. The historian sat back. His breath shallow, his chair creaked faintly in the dim light. The sound sharp in the heavy quiet of the room. He flipped through the pages again, slower this time. Each movement of the parchment echoed, dry and brittle. He looked for impressions. Beneath the ink, traces of letters where the pen had pressed too deeply. There were none. The silence of the archives pressed closer around him. That's when he heard it, not in the room, not in the hall, beyond in his own breath. A faint rhythm beneath. The sound of his exhale, whispered low like syllables rising and falling in a tongue he didn't understand. He froze, his pen slipping from between his fingers and rolling across the desk. Sound stopped, the air felt still again, but his pulse quickened. Each beat sharp in his ears as he packed the folders back into their box. His hands careful but quick, he replaced the lamp's cover, turned the key in the archive door, and stepped out into the cold night air. The city streets outside were slick with rain puddles collected in the cracks of the cobblestones, their surfaces smooth and dark. Beneath the pale light of the street lamp she walked quickly, the folder tucked beneath his arm, his breath fogging faintly as the mist rolled in from the lake. The sound didn't return, not then, but he avoided looking into the water. Others, far from the archives, weren't as careful hikers passing through the hills near Montreux, tracing the old roads where the convent once stood, spoke of strange sounds on certain nights. The wind would be still, the trees unmoving, their boots sinking into the damp soil as the fog crept low around them, and when they stopped, crouching to refill their canteens at the pools of rainwater along the path, they would hear it not from the trees, not from the hills, from the water, a faint sound, rising and falling, whispered, chanting, not loud, not clear, but there, every syllable aligned with their own breaths, as though their reflections were exhaling the words. One hiker, a man who had camped along the ridge for years, described crouching by a wide puddle near the gate. The fog was so dense he could barely see his own boots. The water was still black, his reflection clear despite the dimness, but its mouth moved when his did not, each word inaudible, each breath silent. He leaned closer, squinting, trying to make out the shape of the lips, and that's when he heard it, not a whisper, not a chant, a breath sharp drawn from the reflection itself, as if the figure in the water had inhaled suddenly. His lantern flickered, the puddle rippled, and his reflection smiled, just slightly. Before the water broke apart beneath the falling mist, the man left the hill that night. He has not returned. Others who speak of it keep their voices low, their stories confined to the warmth of taverns, their words careful, as though naming it too clearly might draw it nearer. The records in the Vatican remain sealed, the final pages, still blackened, sit untouched. In the archives, the ink has not faded, and the hill outside Montreux remains empty. But on nights when the fog pools low and the water settles still, those who pass by keep their eyes fixed on the path, because in the reflections, they swear, the convent is waiting whole silent, and the mouths of their own reflections move, syllables, forming in time with the mist words they don't know, and a voice that isn't theirs. The puddle ripples, even when the air is still. The penalty for silence broken was left unspoken. But every sister understood it. The priests departed as quietly. As they arrived, their cars rolling back down the gravel path and vanishing into the mist, the convent was still again. The western corridor stood empty, but as the last of the engines faded into the distance, Agnes turned back toward the chapel door and froze. Every other mirror, still veiled in black cloth, now bore a faint new crease along its fabric, a single vertical fold, as though something beneath had pressed outward just once, then gone. The cloth was still. The hall was silent, but as his breath came faster. Now, shallow and uneven, her pulse loud in her ears as she stepped back into the dimness, because even with the mirror gone, something in the glass still felt awake, waiting. The hill was bare by the end of summer. The stone path that had once wound its way through the trees now led to nothing, only a stretch of wet grass, cut by shallow ruts where wagons had carried the last of the convent's furniture away. The iron gate, once chained shut at night, now hung open, its hinges rusting, its bars slick with rain. No one came to close it. No one came at all. The sisters are gone, not reassigned, not relocated, gone. Locals could not say when the last of them left. There had been no procession, no carts laden with supplies, no sound of farewells drifting down the road one morning. The convent simply stood empty. The shutters on the windows were closed. The courtyard fountain, once fed by a thin stream from the hilltop, had run dry, and the chapel bell, which had tolled every morning and evening for decades, hung still and silent, its rope coiled neatly at the base of the tower. But something wasn't right, though the hill was empty. People said they still saw it, not the building itself, not with their eyes, only in the water, on nights when the fog rolled low through the trees. When the moonlight pooled in the shallow ruts of the road, villagers claimed the convent appeared in the reflections, a faint outline, the peaked roof, the shuttered windows, the bell tower rising black against the silver sky, only in the puddles, never on the hill itself. Children, emboldened by curiosity, crept up the road on such nights, clutching lanterns that burned pale and weak in the mist. They whispered to each other as they neared the iron gate, their voices small against the weight of the fog. The hill was empty, only grass, only the skeletal outlines of trees swaying faintly in the wind. But when they looked down, the puddles told another story. The convent stood whole in the reflections, every stone in place, the tall windows black, and still the chapel door slightly ajar, and the bell tower, its rope moved not with the wind, not with the ripple of the puddles. Surface it swayed in slow, measured arcs, as though someone, somewhere, were pulling it. The children ran. They never returned to the gate, but others, older, more stubborn, followed the road after hearing the stories. Men from the nearby village, women who had once delivered food to the sisters in the colder months. None dared step past the gate. They didn't need to. The water showed them enough. The outline of the convent was always the same, its walls intact, its windows shut, the bell tower silent, but for the faint, unnatural sway of its rope. But the reflections, sometimes they held more than the building. A figure still kneeling just beyond the chapel doors, its shape thin, robed in black, its face bowed low. No wind stirred its veil, no ripple disturbed its outline. The figure did not move, not until someone looked too long. That's when they heard a sound beneath the fog, not the bell, not the wind, something softer, the faint, deliberate creak of wood-like, a floorboard giving beneath a cautious step, even though there was no floor, no hall, nothing but grass and fog. Those who heard it never stayed. They left the road without looking back, their lanterns swinging wildly as they hurried downhill, their breath visible in sharp, panicked bursts. In my morning, when the mist lifted, the puddles showed nothing. No convent, no figure, only a pale sky and the skeletal trees, their branches clawing faintly at the clouds. In the months that followed, no one dared climb the hill. After sunset, the path grew over with weeds. The gate sagged lower, its rust spreading. The iron began to flake in the wind, and when winter came, the puddles froze solid. The reflections stopped, but the silence did not. Even with the hills stripped bare, the nights held a weight to them, the kind that made people keep their curtains drawn, the kind that kept the dogs from barking, their ears flattened as they lay curled by the hearth. No one spoke of the sisters anymore, not in the village, not in the parishes nearby. Even the church's records held nothing beyond the year the priests had come, a line about the removal of a nil object, a blank space where the convent's name should have been, and the sisters. None of them appeared on reassignment rosters, not in Montreux, not anywhere. It was as though they had vanished entirely. Yet, on certain nights, When the fog rolls heavy through the trees, and the rain settles in shallow pools along the road, the locals still say they see it. The convent holds silent, its reflection sharper than the hill itself. And if they linger too long, staring into that pale, unbroken water, some swear they see the figure again kneeling, just inside the chapel door still, as stone until its head lifts just slightly, as though it can tell it's being watched, and the puddle ripples, even when the wind is still. Some truths are not erased, only hidden in reflections we dare not face. The mirror was sealed, the convent was erased, but the whisper remains, waiting in the glass.